Howdy, y'all. Welcome in. Good to see you guys. 2 Kings chapter 7 is where we're going to be. If you want to turn there, not already, 2 Kings 7. As you're making your way to that spot, I'm going to ask you the rhetorical. Are you feeling it? Can you tell any difference when you go to the store? Can you tell any difference at the gas pump compared to a few years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 4 years ago? Okay, yeah. 4, 2, 1. I mean, it's constantly changing, isn't it? And we could go back further from that, and of course, it would be even astronomical. As you can see, the chart just goes through 2023, and I'm sure for 2024, there's going to be a sizable jump that we would see in that also. When I ask you the second rhetorical, does anyone seek any relief? Would you like just a breath of fresh air? Would that be nice to you at all? It might help, huh? But if we feel that way right now from the effects of inflation in our country, just imagine the way the Israelites must have felt. I would say it's even 10 times easily more than what we feel right now. We're having some rough times in Israel. In 2 Kings 7, we're going to see not if the politician, but if the prophet is going to be able to provide us any relief. So Elisha is having his dealings with the Syrians. We began this in chapter 6, and we continue it today. We'll have all of chapter 7, and then about halfway through 8. So chapter 7, verse 1, 2 Kings. Then Elisha said, "Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." What's going on in our country that has all of a sudden produced this terrible inflation? I'm not talking about ours, although it's very applicable also. What's going on in our country, Israel, rewinding, not quite, but about 3,000 years from where we stand? What's taking place is causing inflation. It's a terrific inflation producer. War. There we go. War. Okay. And that leads to famine, okay, which leads to this awful inflation crisis that is taking place. Here's what I'd like to do. Turn back to chapter 6, and you might not even have to turn to do that. You might just look back into chapter 6 and toward the end of it, verses 24 and 25. And it happened after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Syria. This is the guy from our map up to the northeast, and he's causing these problems down in Samaria, which is the capital city of Israel, about 100 miles, roughly 100 miles away. It happened after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered all his army and went up, not like north, but southwest, but up in elevation, and besieged Samaria. So, Justin, there's war taking place, and there's always consequence when it comes to war. And among the greatest, of course, it's not the worst. Number one, it's loss of life and health and all those kinds of things that concern us. But in war, it greatly affects an economy. Verse 25, and there was a great famine then. So, Roy, we have war, we have famine. And the necessary result of that, the price of bread goes up. All your groceries are heading upward. Meat, milk, everything. And indeed, they besieged it until a donkey's head. Okay, so that's significant to Israelites. What do we point out under Old Testament law about a donkey? What kind of a creature do we have here? It's unclean. It's so close to being clean. What's his one problem? Doesn't chew the cud. So it doesn't make the cut. This is an unclean animal to the Israelites. And what are you going to do with the head of an animal? Let's say an animal we really enjoy eating. Let's say beef as an example. Cheese. Brain salad, maybe. That sounds pretty good too. With the tongue deep fried sticking up out of it. Okay. I know some people eat that. Okay. And say it's really good. But yeah, for the most part, I mean, what's a head of any animal going to provide you anyway? It's not the desirable part of the creature. And you have an unclean animal, and the worst part of the unclean animal, listen to this, They besieged it until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver. And we talked about this, and I know inflation kind of sets things back, but in the late 90s, 80 shekels of silver was equivocal approximately, we don't know for sure, but the estimates are about 50 American dollars. That's quite a bit of money even for us, but I'm sure from this point, double it, probably triple it from the late 90s. And you might be looking at $200, $240-ish for the undesirable part of an unclean animal. I mean, you're talking about stuff just out of sight. Basically, people can't eat, so what's being said here. And a fourth of a cab. Now, a cab is a pint. A quarter of a pint. That is not very much. What are we looking at? Half a cup there? Half a cup of animal poo. Dove droppings for 5 shekels of silver. And that's equivocal, again, late 90s. $3, I would say probably easily triple that to now. $15 for a quarter of a cup of animal waste. So, and that's probably being used, I mentioned last week, as fuel for the people. So imagine going to the gas pump and paying $20 for half a cup of gasoline. Okay, you see what I'm saying? I mean, it's way worse than what we experience today. It's absolutely terrible. So just to remind, an unclean animal and a worthless part of it was selling probably equivocal to about $150 or so for us today. And then you have, for us, half a cup of animal droppings, probably $15. Now, switch over to where we are today in chapter 7, verse 1. Then Elisha said, people can't afford to eat, can't afford to burn any fuel. Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow, about this time, a seah of fine flour, that's good stuff, that you want to eat in making food, shall be sold for a shekel. So a seah is about 7 quarts. That's a lot. That's sizable. 7 quarts. A shekel would be about 2/5 of an ounce. And probably silver is the reference, even though it's not mentioned here. And a single shekel is believed, again, talking late 90s, to be worth about 63 cents. Probably triple that. So it would take probably about $2 to buy 7 quarts of really desirable food. Now that's a big switch from what we're seeing. And it's not like, give us 2 or 3 years and we'll see where the economy stands. Tomorrow it's going to change just like that. Now you hear that, and that's going to be hard to believe. And we're going to talk about a guy who has trouble believing this when he hears it. Go ahead, Joe.
Since you brought up last week's lesson.
Yeah, very good, Joe. So for those who might not have heard all, Joe mentioned it. He said a conversation that he had afterward and it was brought up. I would never consider eating my own children, no matter how bad things got. You have the side of desperation, but there's still that side of it, so you'd sure like to think, right? It just shows the depravity of the nation at this point. So, Joe, you're bringing that up in that conversation with somebody else. It makes me think of James 3:16. I think it's one of the most powerful passages that you'll find in the Bible. James 3:16. For where envy, this is the big one, and self-seeking exist, but especially that one, emphasis on where self-seeking or selfishness, I'm the center of the universe, where that exists, confusion and every evil thing are found there. And let's not overlook that descriptor. Anything imaginable. If you have the condition of selfishness, there's no low to which a person will refuse to sink. If I'm the center of everything and God's not. And I agree with you, Joe. I think you see that there. There's just the godlessness and the depravity. Well, it's either me or my child. Obviously, I'm the most important person in existence, so easy choice. Even if it's not, who could ever make that choice? Awful, awful stuff. Thank you, Joe. So it's going to be a huge switch, the promise is. We're going from zero to hero in the economy. Inflation is going to be gone. We're going to deflate it until there's no air that's left in the economic balloon. Really? That's hard to believe that tomorrow, that quickly, things could turn around. Listen to verse 2. So an officer on whose hand the king leaned answered the man of God and said, look, if the Lord could make windows in heaven. All right, let's pause right there for a moment. You go back to Genesis, the book of Genesis. You ever read of any windows in heaven? Yeah, there are windows in heaven. It's not the only place in the Bible. Malachi 3 is another one where windows in heaven are mentioned. Okay, and that's an interesting conversation about all of that. But listen to this guy. Look, if the Lord can make windows in heaven, according to the book of Genesis and Malachi and other places, he has made windows in heaven. So it's not a matter of if, it's that he has. But if God could do this, he's doubting the power of the Lord. 1, 2, he's doubting what God has already done. Anyway, look, if the Lord could make windows in heaven, even if, could this thing be? 1, he doubts what God has done. 2, he doubts what God could do. And 3, he doubts what God could do on the basis of if he could do something. He has no trust in God at all, I believe is what he's saying here. Of course, we know about the Titanic, and it's so big and so strong. Not even God could sink it. All right, that's kind of the mentality that this guy has. That, listen, except in the other direction, this thing's so far gone, our economy, not even God could turn it around. That's a sad state as far as the attitudes in Israel are going. And he, that is Elisha, the man of God, he said, in fact, you shall see it with your eyes. You think not even God can do it. They said that about the Titanic, and they saw it. God showed him. Same thing here. You think it can't happen? God's going to show you. But listen to this. But you shall not eat of it. What do you think he's telling this guy? You're going to... Oh, okay. So we've had these shadowy prophecies before, haven't we? He says, you don't believe that even God can do it. You're going to see God do it tomorrow. But you're not going to get to enjoy the benefits that he'll bring to the nation. It almost sounds like a dire prediction on the man's life. Maybe not. We'll see moving forward what it is. Verse 3, we're going to talk about some lepers. Now there were 4 leprous men at the entrance of the gate, and they said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? And we think about all the common people, and it's so awful, and for the families, and obviously, don't get me wrong, it is. And then you have the people with whom it's always awful. The poor beggars, essentially, outside the city. They've been excommunicated. They can't have any contact, more or less, with others. How bad do you think it is for those who are already deprived to begin with? They have nothing upon nothing. And so these 4 lepers who are sitting at the entrance of the gate of the city, they said to one another, why are we just sitting here until we die? We might as well go do something else. What's it going to hurt? If we say we will enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. People in the city are just as bad off as we are. And if we sit here, we die also. So you go in the city, you die. You sit here, you die. Well, what's behind door number 3? They're contemplating. Now therefore come, let us surrender to the army of the not Assyrians, but the Syrians. If they keep us alive, we shall live. And if they kill us, we shall only die. It's going to be almost like mercy. I mean, that's a bad spot in which to be. To look at, hey, if we go over there and they kill us, better off than if we stay here and go in the city. But it may be that they have mercy on us and they actually let us survive. So we might as well defect to the other side. Would you say this is an honorable or a dishonorable way of thinking? This is not good. Can you imagine, for us, we're proud Americans, right? And with the enemy, and pick who you want, Let's say Russia right now. Okay, say, well, things aren't looking very well, but if I surrender, the Russians might go ahead and do me in. That would be merciful. But if I defect to them, they might give me some food so I can actually survive. As Americans, we would look at that and say, you are despicable creatures. You should never consider such a thing. So that's what they're doing right here. We can defect to the other side. Verse 5. They rose at twilight. In Hebrew, you probably remember that's literally between the evenings. It's around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They rose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians, and when they had come to the outskirts of the Syrian camp, to their surprise, no one was there. Let's not forget what's going on, the conditions in Israel. Awful inflation caused by terrible famine, caused by awful war. We have war taking place because the city has been besieged now for some time. And so they go out to surrender to the enemy that has besieged the city of Samaria, and nobody's there. Well, they've been there for a long time by this point. I mean, who knows exactly how long, but the people aren't there any longer, the soldiers. For the Lord, we read, had caused the army of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses, the noise of a great army. They heard this. They knew it was there. So they said to one another, the Syrians speaking, look, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to attack us. This isn't very rational thinking on their part. The city is completely and perfectly surrounded. This isn't in the age of internet and cell phones. So how is it possible that the king could have gotten any word out to anyone that they needed help? It couldn't have happened. They have it perfectly shut up. So they're not logical in their thinking. And they hear things that don't exist. Someone's gotten involved here. Clouded their mind, clouded their senses. They're all sorts of confused. They think the Hittites and the Egyptians have come up to attack them. Therefore, verse 7, they arose and fled at that very time that the lepers are like, man, we're going to die here, we're going to die in there, might as well go on to the other side. And at the very time they decide to go walk in, these people have just freshly left the scene. And they left their camp intact. Their tents, their horses, and their donkeys, and they fled for their lives. Now think about how bad this is. They don't even bother folding up their new expensive tents that they carry around with them. Just leave the campsite as it is. For their horses and their donkeys. Can you imagine being in such a hurry and you're ready to leave and never to come back that you don't even bother to take your vehicles with you? Just whoever can have them or do whatever they want with them. I mean, that's what these are to these people. Verse 8, and when the lepers came to the outskirts of the camp, they went into one tent, and they found food there. That's something they haven't had in forever. Not good, anyway. They found food inside, and they ate, and they drank, and they find in it silver and gold and clothing, and they take these and hide them away, and then they come back, and they enter another tent and carried some from there also, and they went and hid it. What do these lepers have in mind? There we go. Looking out for number one, aren't they? That's kind of the mentality in the country. You look at all this evil that's going on in Israel. Why is all this evil taking place? James 3:16, where you find selfishness or self-seeking, you will find every evil thing that's there. They don't care to desert their country. They're open to doing it. And that's easy for us to say. Now, in fairness to them, they are in an awful spot, starving to death. So again, that's easy to say when we're comfortable and we're eating all the food that we like. Nevertheless, they've defected from their country, and they go over and they see all this good stuff, and they just start filling themselves full of the good stuff and taking all the riches and hiding them away for themselves. Well, that's what's going on right now. Miss Barbara? 2 Kings 7, we are in verse 8. Yeah, 2 Kings 7, 8. All right, who would like to tell us our memory verse now in 9? There's Change of mentality. Credit these guys for it. 2 Kings 7:9. Go ahead, Roy. Very good. That's a tough one, isn't it? I was the same way with it. Took me a little while on it. So there's a change in mentality with these guys. I think it's a real credit to them. You know, our lives are not defined by the mistakes that we make. Our lives are defined by what we do relative to those mistakes once we've committed them, how we think about them, how we approach them. Of course, we know David, the guy after God's own heart, made some of the worst mistakes of any person who's ever lived. Many of them, huge mistakes. Why is he the man after God's own heart? Not because of an absence of mistakes, but because of how he looked at them and how he addressed them after he committed them. That's what makes all the difference. Where are we time-wise? We probably won't have the time to do so. I like this passage, though. Matthew 21, 28 through 32. If you'd like to jot that down or even glance at it, you're welcome to. Matthew 21, chapter 21, verses 28 through 32. Jesus tells a parable, and there are two guys. And there's a master, and to two servants, he tells them what he wants them to go do. And the first one says, nah, I'm not going to do it. And then after it mentions, he regretted it. And he went and did what the master told him. Now the second one has a terrific response. He says, oh yeah, I'm going to be right on that. Lickety-split. And then he decides, I'm not going to do it later on. And Jesus asked, which of these two do you think the master wants? Which did his master's will? And they all understood the first one. And Jesus says, here's the lesson to learn from this. God has his teaching through the prophets, and you all, the religious leaders, rejected it. And the tax collectors and the harlots, they rejected it. But then God sends John the Baptist, and you all reject him, the religious leaders. And the prostitutes and the tax collectors listen, and they change. And that's the lesson that's connected. Our lives are not defined by the mistakes that we made, but by how we react to the mistakes once we make them. So I know it's easy to look at these guys and say, well, these are just a bunch of traitors and lowlifes or just selfish people like everyone else. Well, I think they do display the character of the nation early on, but that does not define who they are, because their consciences get to them, and on that very day, and they make this statement, what we are doing is not right. And it's time for us to fix this wrong. 1 John 1, what's the key to walking in the light? It's not, well, I never commit a sin. No, the whole thing assumes if we say we have no sin or we never commit any sins, we're just liars. It's going to happen. It doesn't give us a license to sin. Doesn't mean we ought to be sinning every minute or every hour, okay? But to understand, there are going to be mistakes that are made even though we're trying to do right. What defines us from 1 John 1? Verse 9, if we confess our sins. If we're man and woman for our youngers, if we're boy or girl enough to own up to our wrongdoing, saying, look, what I've done is not right, and this is something that needs to be rectified moving forward. I think these are good people, and it shows. Perfect people? No, they struggle with selfishness, just like you and I do. Great patriots? They haven't always been that. But what defines them is what they do with their mistakes. And this simple statement, what we are doing is not right. Let's fix it. And let's go tell our fellow countrymen that the victory is ours to be had. So verse number 10, they went and they called to the gatekeepers of the city, and they told them, saying, we went to the Syrian camp, and surprisingly, no one was there. Not a human sound. Only horses and donkeys. So for us, it's the trucks, the cars, and the SUVs, and then the military side of things. We have the tanks. We want them. They're ours. Guns that are left. We can just go confiscate all this for ourselves. Only horses and donkeys tied, and the tents intact. And the gatekeepers called out, and they told it to the king's household inside. So the king arose in the night. This is big news. Remember, this starts about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This is going well into the night from the messengers going back and forth. The king arose in the night and said to his servants, "Let me tell you now what the Syrians have done to us." This is the politician who knows everything. He hasn't been there himself. And here's what's going on, though. He's going to tell the common people everything they don't know, all the ignorant ones. Let me tell you what the Syrians are planning here. They know that we're hungry. Therefore, they've gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the field. They're just watching all the supplies that they left behind, saying, "When they come out of the city, we shall catch them alive and get into the city." And so the besiegement will be over, and so also will the conflict, and we're going to become their slaves. And one of the servants answered and said, now this is one of the dumb guys that doesn't know anything, who shouldn't even be talking to the all-knowing politician, okay? But he says, "Allow your servant, sir, please, to give a suggestion to you. Please let several men take 5 of the remaining horses which are left in the city." There aren't many horses. Why do you think many horses aren't remaining in Samaria by this point? Yeah, these... I've never eaten a horse. Have you? Okay. Okay. As far as I know, I've never eaten a horse. All right, so it's possible. I'm going to guess there's a reason that I've never eaten a horse, and that as far as you know, you haven't either, probably. I'm going to guess that horse meat probably isn't the best thing in the world. Hey, when you're starving to death, smoked horse meat's probably some of the best stuff. What do you got? Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, and they're valuable. Right. Okay. Right. Yeah, I appreciate that, Tony. So I didn't know it actually, but they have so many other uses, including, like pets. But right. Right. Okay. But okay, so for their value for other things, you wouldn't normally do it, and so maybe at least look at it this way. But when you're starving to death, you'll do anything to get by. You'll eat your, maybe not you or me, I hope not. But as has been proven in Israel, they've been eating their own children in order to survive. That's how bad things have gotten. So the suggestion is, let's take 5 of the horses. I know we don't have many left. Let's take 5 of the horses that are left, and some of the men, several men of Israel. Look, they may either become like all the multitude of Israel that are left in it, or, indeed, say, they may become like all the multitude of Israel left from those who are consumed. So let us send them and see. It's, we could survive, be like those that are scraping by. They could become dead. Maybe you're right, and they come upon them and they're killed. By this point, once again, kind of like the lepers, what's it going to matter, really, what happens to them, as far as if any calamity falls on them? Therefore, they took 2 chariots with horses, and the king sent them in the direction of the Syrian army, saying, "Go and see." And they went after them to the Jordan, and indeed, all the road was full of garments and weapons which the Syrians had thrown away in their haste. Which is interesting. Why would you throw this stuff away if you're leaving anyway, do you think? Especially your weapons. Why would you throw down your weapons? There you go. I think you don't want anything weighing you down. You got to get out of there, because after all, the Hittites and the Egyptians are coming. We know because we've heard them. No, they haven't, but they think they have. Justin? Okay. So lighter. Joe? There you go. That could be. It might also be, as they're not thinking rationally, they're doing all kinds of irrational things, but I think it's probably that. I'm going to say they probably want to lighten the load. Maybe they want to portray themselves as innocent, or at the very least, they can't produce any harm now. All these would make sense. So the messengers returned, and they told the king. Then the people went out. Turns out the servant was right, not the politician. Then the people went out and plundered the tents of the Syrians. So a seah, 7 quarts of good stuff, fine flour, was sold for a shekel, What were we looking at back then? 63 cents times 3, about $2. You buy about for. Now you think about how bad things were, where you're buying the worthless portion of an unclean animal for probably the equivalent of $150 to us. And you go from that to being able to buy 7 quarts of the best flour, perfectly ground. You don't even have to put the work into it, for about $2. We went from something that sounds awful to us in our economy to, in our economy, the second part sounds incredible. I would love if you could buy fine flour and that much of it for less than $2. Why did this happen? How? According to the word of the Lord. So it turns out God does know what he's talking about, after all. It turns out, in his infinite power, he can turn a nation's economy around just like that. You don't even have to wait 2, 3, 5, 10 years. It can happen overnight with God. In verse 17, now the king had appointed the officer. Which one? I think that goes back to verse 2. So, an officer on whose hand the king leaned. Remember that? Okay. So the same guy. Now the king had appointed the very officer, back from verse 2, on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. But the people were so excited for all the food and all the weapons and all the silver and all the gold and all the clothes, all the tents that they used camping for the weekend, and to get out and to get hold of those things themselves, that they trampled the guy in the gate, and he died, just as the man of God had said, who spoke when the king came down to him. So it happened just as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, "Oh, look, 2 seahs of barley are being sold for a shekel, and a seah of fine flour for a shekel shall be sold tomorrow about this time in the gate of Samaria." Then that officer had answered the man of God and said, "Now look, if the Lord would make windows in heaven," he's done that, but if he were to do so, even if, could such a thing be? Would even the God of heaven have the power to actually turn the economy around that quickly? And he had said, in fact, "You shall see it with your eyes." Did the guy live to see it? Yeah. But how much of that food and the silver and gold and the clothes and the tents did he get to enjoy? Not a single piece of any of it, just as the man of God had predicted. And he said, in fact, "You shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it." I know we're running a little light on time, but this is so important. I think this may be the most powerful teaching in all of this. So Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. The key to faith is that we trust in what we haven't seen. Well, how can I know that an economy can turn around just like that? I've never seen that before. Well, do you believe the God of heaven who created all things? And you know all the things that he stated are going to happen before it happens, and it's always happened exactly how it says. That's evidence. Even though you haven't seen an economy turn around just like that, that's evidence in the power of the God of heaven. So if he were to say, tomorrow, a gallon of gas will be 50 cents. If he were to say, you can buy groceries for your family of 6 for $80, let me tell you, that sounds unbelievable right now. But put yourself in those shoes. Would you believe it? If he said, you've never seen something happen like that, such a transformation. Would you believe it if he said it? Verse 6 of Hebrews 11. Do you also understand that without faith, you might as well quit right now? It's impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe, first of all, that he is. He's the one who exists and can do anything, and that he cares about you and everyone around you, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Do you believe in His power, number one? Number two, do you really believe in His power that He wants to use for you and for your loved ones around you? Joe?
But just a matter of reference back to what we come from last week about the access. You never see Elisha call on the name of the Lord or speak these words that he says comes from the Lord. It's a miracle. He did it, no doubt. Think in this particular instance this week. He starts out by saying, these are the words of the Lord. These aren't mine. I'm not telling you this is going to happen. God told me this and told me to relay this to you. I think that's why the punishment is so great.
Yeah, it could be. Very good, Joe. Hadn't thought about that. Excellent. Verse 20, and so it happened to him, for the people trampled the guy in the gate, and he died. With more time we could. But think about also how faith played into things in the promised land, and hey, you can go in, you can overtake this. We don't think we can because that's what God had said, and they missed out on the promised land. Why? Because of faith. Without it, you cannot please Him. But we're told there still remains an opportunity for us of rest in the promised land. So let's take a valuable lesson from it. When God has told us, number one, it's there because I'm powerful and I put it there. And number two, I built it for you to enjoy. We'd better believe Him and live like it. Chapter 8 of 2 Kings. Let's cover these first 15 verses as we wrap things up. Verse 1. Then Elisha spoke to the woman whose son he had restored to life. You recall that? Saying, arise and go, you and your household, and stay wherever you can, for the Lord has called for a famine, and furthermore it will be upon the land for 7 years. Have you been counting all these famines and references as we've been going through? What's going on in Israel? It's famine after famine after famine after famine. Why are things so tough in this land? Joe, this is a promise that God made back in Deuteronomy 28, over half a millennium ago. Prior to the Israelites going into the promised land, He said, look, if you'll fear me and obey me as a country, I will open for you the windows of heaven, and I will pour out rain upon your land. It's an agricultural society. You'll have an abundance of crops and wealth, and life will be good for you. But if you refuse to obey my voice, if you do not trust me, then the windows of heaven will be barred shut, and it will be like hard clay on the ground. You won't grow anything, and life will be miserable for you. And here we are 600 plus years later, and God's just fulfilling the promise that He made as the people have forsaken Him. So Elisha tells this lady, look, God has shown me this, that this famine's going to be on the land as bad as it is now, has been anyway. There's a temporary reprieve here. But it's going to get way worse, and it's going to be a period of 7 years, so you need to be a nomad during this period and just go from place to place where you can find sustenance. So the woman arose and did according to the saying of the man of God. And she went with her household and dwelt in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. God's bringing more blessing on the enemy than He is on His own people. Perfection, 7 years. It came to pass at the end of 7 years that the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, and she went to make an appeal to the king of Israel for her house and for her land. So what's assumed by this is while she was gone, people noticed this, and they moved in. And they took over her house and her land, and they've been farming it and taking in whatever produce. I know it's a rough time, but they can bring in. And now they probably are staking a claim. Hey, she left this behind, and this is our house. This is our farm now. Then the king talked with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God. Last time we read about Gehazi, what's going on with him? What's new in Gehazi's life? He's a leper. He's an outcast. And the king's talking with him, which would mean that he must have called for him. Well, when you're the most powerful ruler in the nation, what do you want to talk with lepers you can't even get close to? The man of God was curious, and he said, tell me, please, all the great things that Elisha's done. I'd like for you to recap everything that's been going on. Now it happened as he was telling the king how he had restored the dead to life, that suddenly, what do you know? There's the woman who just shows up out of nowhere. about whom he's talking, whose son he had restored to life, appealing to the king for her house and for her land. And Gehazi said, "My lord, O king, what do you know? This is the woman, the very one I was just telling you about. And this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life." Do you think providence might be at work here? Romans 8, verse 18, "I consider the sufferings, the hardships we endure in this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." Now that's in eternity, but for here and now, verse 28 of Romans 8, we know that all things work presently together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called for purpose. God doesn't promise we're never going to have hardship like the people in the world. What he does promise is even during periods of hardship, I will always look out for my own. Do you think it might be providence? That it just enters into this guy's mind 7 years down the road. You know, I remember Elisha and a lot of cool things he did in our country. I'm going to call the leper who used to work with him to come and to tell me everything he was doing. And as he is telling him the story of how he raised the woman's son to life, the woman knocks on the king's door. "My king, this is her right here, and that's the boy that he raised from the dead." Wow. Now what benefit do you think that's going to be as she comes and relays the information of "Oh king, there's a man who's stolen my house and my farm"? What effect do you think that's going to have on him? He's going to think, "Oh, well, he's so excited about this woman and what happened to her. I better do her some good." And normally he's not a great guy. And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed a certain officer for her, saying, "I want you to restore all that was hers and all the proceeds of the field from the day that she left the land until now." It's not just, hey, give her back what's hers, but any benefit that's been taken, that person or that family has to repay in his judgment, all of it back to her. You think God cares about and takes care of his own during times of hardship? Verse 7, "Then Elisha went to Damascus." This is pretty bold. Elisha and Ben-Hadad, the king up to the northeast, haven't been on friendly terms lately. And he enters into 100 miles to the northeast, enemy territory, Elisha does, and Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, was sick. And it was told him, saying, "The man of God has come here." And the king said to Hazael, "Take a present in your hand, and go to meet the man of God, and inquire of the Lord by him, saying, 'Shall I recover from this disease?'" So Hazael went to meet him and took a present with him of every good thing of Damascus, the capital. 40 camel loads. It's a lot of stuff. And he came and stood before him and said, "Your son, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria." These guys hate each other. And notice how kindly he's treating the prophet. Oh, he showers on him all of these gifts. And he says, "I am your son," or "You're our spiritual father." Really? Laying it on thick. "Shall I recover from this disease, by the way, just out of curiosity?" And Elisha said to him, "Go say to him, you shall certainly recover. However, the Lord has shown me that he will really die." Now this isn't a lie, what he tells him. Go tell him he'll recover from the disease. The disease isn't going to kill you, but you are going to die. Then he set his countenance, Elisha did, in a stare until he, this servant of the king, Hazael, was ashamed. And I believe the reason is this. The guy is already plotting to kill the king. And Elisha knows that. And now he knows that Elisha knows. Oh, he's not going to die from the disease. He's burning a hole into his soul as he stares into him. And then Elisha, the man of God, starts weeping. And Hazael said, "Why is my Lord weeping?" He answered, "Because I know the evil that you will do to the children of Israel. Their strongholds you'll set on fire. Their young men you will kill with the sword. You'll dash their children, rip open their women with child." So Hazael said, "But what is your servant, a dog? I'm a nobody. How could I do this gross thing?" And Elisha answered, "The Lord has shown me that you will become king over Syria," just as God predicted. Then he departed from Elisha and came to his master, who said to him, "What did Elisha say to you?" And he answered, "He told me you would surely recover." But he doesn't bother telling him part B of the information, but you're not going to live. It happened the next day that he took a thick cloth, dipped it in water, spread it over the king's face so that he died, suffocated him. And Hazael, sure enough, reigned in the king's place. Now, before you go feeling too bad for Ben-Hadad, let's not forget what kind of guy he's been. And he should not have survived over these last many years, probably another decade or two. He should have already been dead, but Ahab did not do the job back in the day. And with Ben-Hadad, eventually, whatever it is that you give out, you're going to receive back yourself. That's what takes place here with him. So that takes us through chapter 8. We've actually already covered the second half when we were looking at the descendants of Jezebel. So for our next study, it'll be in the 9th chapter of 2 Kings, 2 Kings 9, and we're going to do verse 35 for our memory work. Any final thoughts on God's effect in government and how quickly he can turn things around? Okay, enjoyed the talk with you. Thank you.